My name is Detective Frank Morrison, and I'm 71 years old. For 43 years, I've carried the weight of the most disturbing case in law enforcement history, a case that was buried so deep by federal authorities that it officially never happened. In 1981, I was a young detective with the Whatcom County Sheriff's Department in Washington State when I was called to investigate what appeared to be a brutal double homicide in the remote wilderness near Mount Baker. What I found at that crime scene challenged everything I thought I knew about intelligence, justice, and the thin line between civilization and savagery. The creature responsible left behind evidence that proved these beings possess not just consciousness, but a moral complexity that makes their capacity for violence infinitely more terrifying than any mindless animal attack. The message written in human blood on that cabin wall contained truths about our species that the government has spent decades trying to suppress. And now, as I face my final years, I know the world must hear what really happened in those dark woods. Before that, I continue, subscribe to the channel and comment down below where you're watching from. It was October 15th, 1981, and I was 34 years old, working as a detective for the Whatcom County Sheriff's Department in northwestern Washington State. I'd been on the force for 8 years, working my way up from patrol officer to detective, and I thought I'd seen every kind of human depravity that existed. Domestic violence, drug-related murders, robbery gone wrong, the usual catalogue of crimes that plague rural communities where poverty and isolation create perfect breeding grounds for violence. The call came in at 6:47 a.m. on a grey, drizzling morning that seemed to leach all colour from the world. A hiker had discovered what appeared to be a crime scene at a remote cabin about 12 miles northeast of the town of Glacier, deep in the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest. The area was accessible only by a logging road that turned into a hiking trail, surrounded by old-growth forest so dense that satellite imagery couldn't penetrate the canopy. My partner, Detective Sarah Chen, and I were assigned to the case. Sarah was 42, a veteran investigator who had transferred from Seattle PD after burning out on urban crime. She was methodical, analytical, and possessed the kind of dark humor that helped cops survive the worst aspects of human nature. Together, we had solved dozens of cases, and I trusted her judgment more than anyone else in the department. The drive to the crime scene took us through some of the most beautiful and isolated country in the Pacific Northwest. Ancient Douglas firs and western red cedars towered above the narrow road, their trunks disappearing into a canopy so thick that even at midday, the forest floor remained in perpetual twilight. The air was heavy with moisture and the rich scent of decomposing leaves, that earthy perfume that only exists in temperate rainforests. The cabin itself was a small hand-built structure that had been used by hunters and hikers for decades. It sat in a clearing perhaps 50 yards across, surrounded by trees so massive they seemed to form natural walls. The building was simple: 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and a covered porch that faced west toward the distant peaks of the Cascade Range. But as we approached the structure, it became clear that something terrible had happened there. The first thing I noticed was the silence. In healthy forest, there's always sound: birds calling, insects buzzing, the rustle of small animals moving through the undergrowth. But the area around the cabin was completely quiet, as if every living thing had fled in terror from whatever had occurred there. The second thing I noticed was the smell. Even before we reached the porch, the metallic scent of blood mixed with something else, something wild and musky that I couldn't immediately identify, hung heavy in the damp air. The front door of the cabin stood open, hanging at an odd angle that suggested it had been torn from its hinges rather than simply opened. Deep gouges in the wood around the doorframe looked like claw marks, but they were too large and too precisely spaced to have been made by any animal I knew. Sarah and I drew our weapons and approached the cabin with the careful precision that years of training had drilled into us. We called out, identifying ourselves as law enforcement, but received no response except the echo of our own voices bouncing off the surrounding trees. What we found inside that cabin still haunts my dreams 43 years later. The victims were 2 men in their early 30s, both experienced outdoorsmen based on their equipment and clothing. Their identification revealed them to be Marcus Webb, a wildlife photographer from Portland, and James Mitchell, a freelance journalist who specialized in environmental issues. They had been camping in the area for several days, apparently investigating reports of unusual wildlife activity. But these weren't random victims of animal attack or human violence. The scene was arranged, deliberate, almost ritualistic in its precision. Both men had been killed quickly and efficiently. their necks broken with what the coroner would later determine was a single, precisely applied twist that required enormous strength and anatomical knowledge. There were no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds, no indication that they had suffered before death. Whatever had killed them possessed both the physical capability to end human life instantly and the restraint to do so without causing unnecessary pain. The bodies had been positioned carefully in the center of the cabin's main room, laid out side by side with their arms crossed over their chests in a pose that suggested respect rather than contempt. Their personal belongings, cameras, notebooks, camping equipment, had been arranged around them in neat piles, undisturbed except for one crucial item. James Mitchell's notebook was missing several pages that had been torn out with surgical precision. The remaining pages contained detailed observations about unusual footprints, strange vocalizations heard during the night, and theories about the intelligence level of whatever creatures were responsible for the phenomena they were investigating. But it was what we found on the cabin wall that transformed this from a mysterious double homicide into something that challenged our understanding of consciousness, intelligence, and moral reasoning. Written in what forensic analysis would later confirm was human blood, the victim's blood, was a message that covered most of the cabin's back wall. The writing was precise, controlled, clearly the work of an intelligent mind rather than random smearing. The letters were formed in a style that suggested familiarity with human writing systems, but with subtle differences that indicated a non-human origin. The message read, "These two sought to expose us for money and fame. They came with cameras to make us spectacles for your entertainment. They spoke of capturing one of our young to prove our existence to your world. We have watched your species for centuries. We know what happens to those you discover. We have seen the zoos, the laboratories, the cages where you keep those you consider lesser beings. We will not allow this to happen to our children. This is our warning. Leave us in peace or face the consequences of your intrusion. We are not animals to be studied or captured. We are people, and we will defend ourselves as such." Below the main message, written in smaller letters, was an additional note that made my blood run cold. "Detective Morrison and Detective Chen, we know you are reading this. We know you will be tempted to share what you have found. Consider carefully whether your duty to truth is worth the lives of your families. We watch, we remember, we protect our own." Sarah and I stared at that wall in stunned silence, trying to process the implications of what we were seeing. This wasn't just evidence of a double homicide. It was proof of an intelligent species capable of premeditated murder, moral reasoning, and sophisticated understanding of human society and law enforcement procedures. The creature, or creatures responsible, knew our names before we arrived at the scene. They understood the structure of police investigations, the likelihood that detectives would be assigned to the case, and the potential consequences of their actions being made public. They had committed murder, not in a moment of rage or fear, but as a calculated response to what they perceived as a threat to their community. Most terrifyingly, they had demonstrated the ability to research human individuals, to identify our families, and to make credible threats against innocent people who had no connection to their conflict with the victims. "Frank," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible in the oppressive silence of the cabin, "what the hell are we dealing with here?" I didn't have an answer. In 8 years of police work, I had never encountered anything that prepared me for this level of intelligence, combined with this capacity for violence. The message on the wall revealed a mind capable of complex reasoning, moral judgment, and strategic planning, but also willing to commit murder to protect its interests. We spent the next 6 hours documenting the crime scene with a thoroughness that bordered on obsession. Every photograph, every measurement, every piece of physical evidence was catalogued and preserved. The blood samples, the torn notebook pages, the precise positioning of the bodies. All of it was recorded with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that might be crucial in court. But even as we worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest around the cabin seemed to press in on us, and more than once I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision that disappeared when I turned to look directly. The sensation of unseen eyes tracking our every movement was so strong that both Sarah and I found ourselves constantly checking over our shoulders. The forensic team arrived in the late afternoon, along with the coroner and additional investigators from the state police. The crime scene was unlike anything any of them had encountered, and the initial theories ranged from cult killing to elaborate hoax to some kind of psychological break that had caused the perpetrator to believe they were a mythical creature. But the physical evidence told a different story. The blood used for the message was definitely human, matching the victims' blood types. The handwriting analysis revealed consistent letter formation and spacing that indicated a single author working with deliberate care rather than frenzied scrawling. Most importantly, the height and angle of the writing suggested someone at least 8 feet tall with arm reach, far exceeding normal human proportions. The footprints around the cabin were even more disturbing. The crime scene team found dozens of impressions in the soft earth, showing feet that were unmistakably humanoid, but far larger than any human could produce. The prints were 18 inches long and 7 inches wide, with clear toe impressions and arch definition that ruled out any kind of artificial creation. But what made these prints truly unsettling was their distribution pattern. The creature had circled the cabin multiple times, approaching from different angles, studying the structure and its occupants before making its move. The depth and clarity of the impressions suggested someone weighing at least 600 pounds, moving with surprising stealth and precision. The investigation that followed was unlike anything in law enforcement history. Within 48 hours of our initial report, federal agents arrived and took control of the case. They claimed jurisdiction under various environmental protection statutes and national security provisions that seemed to have been written specifically for this type of situation. Agent Patricia Walsh was the lead federal investigator, a woman in her 40s with the kind of cold efficiency that suggested extensive experience with classified operations. She made it clear from our first meeting that the case was now beyond local law enforcement authority and that our role would be limited to providing information and maintaining absolute secrecy about what we had discovered. "Gentlemen," she said during our initial briefing, "what you've stumbled onto has implications far beyond a simple homicide investigation. There are national security considerations that require federal oversight and coordination with agencies that don't officially exist." The federal team included specialists I had never heard of, cryptozoologists, behavioral psychologists, linguistic experts, and what appeared to be military personnel trained in tracking and capture operations. Their presence suggested that the government had been aware of these creatures for some time and had protocols in place for dealing with situations exactly like this one. Over the following weeks, I learned that the Webb Mitchell murders weren't an isolated incident. Agent Walsh showed me classified files documenting similar cases going back decades, researchers, hunters, and explorers who had gotten too close to the truth and had been eliminated with the same surgical precision and moral justification. "The creatures you're dealing with aren't mindless animals," Walsh explained during one of our briefings. "They're an intelligent species with their own social structures, moral codes, and defensive capabilities. They've been watching human civilization develop for centuries, and they've learned to protect themselves from discovery through whatever means necessary." The pattern was consistent across all the cases. Victims were individuals who posed a genuine threat to the creature's secrecy, people with cameras, recording equipment, or the credibility to convince others of what they had discovered. The killings were always quick and efficient, designed to minimize suffering while maximizing the deterrent effect on other potential threats. But the Webb Mitchell case was different in one crucial respect. It was the first time the creatures had left a written message, the first time they had demonstrated such sophisticated understanding of human law enforcement procedures, and the first time they had made specific threats against investigating officers. "They're escalating," Walsh told me during one of our private conversations. "Previous incidents were reactive, responses to immediate threats, but this shows premeditation, planning, and a level of intelligence that frankly terrifies some people in Washington." The investigation revealed disturbing details about the victims' activities in the days before their deaths. James Mitchell's remaining notebook entries showed that he and Webb had been tracking the creatures for over a week, using motion-activated cameras and audio recording equipment to document their behavior. They had discovered a family group consisting of at least 6 individuals, including what appeared to be juveniles. Most damaging of all, they had developed a plan to capture one of the younger creatures using tranquilizer darts and portable cages. Mitchell's notes revealed that they believed a live specimen would be worth millions in book deals, documentary rights, and scientific study opportunities. The creatures had apparently been aware of this plan and had taken preemptive action to protect their young. From their perspective, Agent Walsh explained, they were defending their children from kidnappers. The fact that those kidnappers happened to be human beings was irrelevant to their moral calculus. This revelation forced me to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, self-defense, and the rights of intelligent beings who existed outside human legal frameworks. If these creatures were truly conscious, truly capable of moral reasoning, then their actions might be legally justified under any reasonable definition of self-defense. But the implications of that reasoning were staggering. If we acknowledged the creatures' right to defend themselves, we would also have to acknowledge their existence as a separate intelligent species with rights and legal standing. The social, scientific, and religious upheaval that would follow such recognition was beyond calculation. The federal response was predictable: complete suppression of all evidence and elimination of anyone who might threaten the secret. The official report listed the Webb-Mitchell deaths as the result of a bear attack, despite the obvious inconsistencies with that explanation. The crime scene was sanitized, the physical evidence was classified, and everyone involved in the investigation was required to sign non-disclosure agreements that carried severe criminal penalties for violation. Sarah and I were transferred to different departments and warned that any attempt to discuss the case would result in federal prosecution, and the safety of our families could not be guaranteed. The message was clear: forget what we had seen, or face consequences that went far beyond professional discipline. But forgetting was impossible. The intelligence revealed in that blood-written message haunted me for months. The creatures had demonstrated not just consciousness, but a sophisticated understanding of human society, law enforcement procedures, and the potential consequences of their actions. They had committed murder not in a moment of animal rage, but as a calculated response to a perceived threat. More disturbing still, they had shown the ability to research individual human beings, to identify our personal connections, and to make credible threats against innocent people. The fact that they knew our names before we arrived at the crime scene suggested a level of surveillance and intelligence gathering capability that rivaled any government agency. Over the following years, I began to notice patterns that suggested the creature's intelligence network was far more extensive than anyone realized. Missing person cases in remote wilderness areas often involved individuals who had been researching cryptozoological phenomena. Equipment failures and accidents seemed to plague scientific expeditions that ventured too close to certain territories. Witnesses to unusual sightings frequently recanted their stories or simply disappeared from public view. The creatures weren't just defending themselves reactively, they were actively managing human perception and behavior to maintain their secrecy. They had developed sophisticated methods for discouraging investigation while avoiding the kind of direct confrontation that had been necessary in the Webb-Mitchell case. But they had also demonstrated their willingness to escalate to lethal force when their core interests were threatened. In 1985, 4 years after the original incident, I was contacted by Agent Walsh with disturbing news. A team of military specialists had been tracking the creature family responsible for the Webb-Mitchell murders, using satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar to map their territory and movement patterns. The creatures had apparently detected this surveillance and had responded with a coordinated attack on the military base, where the tracking operation was headquartered. 3 soldiers were killed, and millions of dollars in equipment was destroyed in what appeared to be a precisely planned raid that demonstrated intimate knowledge of military procedures and security protocols. They're not just defending themselves anymore, Walsh told me during our clandestine meeting. They're taking offensive action against perceived threats. The intelligence community is starting to classify them as a potential terrorist organization. The military response was swift and overwhelming. Special Forces units were deployed to the Pacific Northwest with orders to locate and eliminate the creature family using whatever means necessary. The operation was classified at the highest levels and involved resources typically reserved for international conflicts. But the creatures had vanished. Despite months of intensive searching using the most advanced tracking technology available, no trace of the family was found. They had simply disappeared into the vast wilderness of the Cascade Range, leaving behind no evidence of their passage and no indication of their destination. The failed military operation marked a turning point in the government's approach to the creature problem. Direct confrontation had proven ineffective, and the creatures' demonstrated intelligence and defensive capabilities made them too dangerous to pursue openly. The decision was made to shift to a containment strategy focused on monitoring, disinformation, and elimination of threats to secrecy. I was recruited into this new approach in 1987, 6 years after the original incident. Agent Walsh offered me a position with a classified federal task force dedicated to managing the creature situation. The work involved investigating reports of sightings, discrediting witnesses, and occasionally dealing with individuals who posed genuine threats to the secret. "We need people with your experience," Walsh explained. "People who understand what we're dealing with and why it has to remain hidden. The alternative, public knowledge of an intelligent species capable of premeditated murder, would cause social chaos that could destroy civilization as we know it." For the next 15 years, I worked in the shadows of law enforcement, using my skills and authority to protect a secret that grew heavier with each passing year. I investigated dozens of cases involving creature encounters, always working to discredit genuine sightings while identifying and neutralizing serious threats to the cover-up. The work was morally complex in ways that traditional police work had never been. I found myself lying to honest people, destroying evidence of legitimate scientific discoveries, and occasionally participating in operations that ruined the lives of individuals whose only crime was seeking the truth. But I also came to understand the reasoning behind the secrecy. The creatures weren't just another species to be studied and catalogued. They were intelligent beings with their own agenda, their own moral code, and their own capacity for violence when threatened. Public knowledge of their existence would inevitably lead to attempts at contact, capture, and exploitation that would trigger responses far more devastating than the Webb Mitchell murders. The creatures had demonstrated their ability to plan coordinated attacks, to gather intelligence on human activities, and to strike with surgical precision against targets they considered threatening. If they perceived humanity as a whole as a threat to their survival, the consequences would be catastrophic. During my years with the task force, I encountered evidence of the creatures' expanding influence and capabilities. They had apparently established communication networks spanning the entire Pacific Northwest, allowing for coordination between family groups separated by hundreds of miles. They had developed sophisticated methods for avoiding detection while maintaining surveillance of human activities in their territories. Most disturbing of all, they had begun to demonstrate technological capabilities that suggested rapid advancement in their understanding of human systems and vulnerabilities. In 1995, a power grid failure that blacked out most of western Washington was officially attributed to equipment malfunction, but classified analysis revealed evidence of deliberate sabotage using techniques that required intimate knowledge of electrical engineering principles. Security cameras at the affected facilities had captured brief glimpses of figures moving with inhuman speed and agility through areas that should have been impossible to access. The creatures were learning, adapting, and expanding their capabilities at a rate that alarmed even the most experienced intelligence analysts. "They're not just hiding from us anymore," Agent Walsh told me during one of our final meetings before my retirement from the task force. "They're studying us, learning our weaknesses, preparing for something we don't understand yet." I retired from federal service in 2002, 21 years after the Webb Mitchell incident, but the weight of the secret continued to grow heavier with each passing year. The creature's message written in blood on that cabin wall had proven prophetic. They were indeed people with all the moral complexity and capacity for violence that implied, but they were people who existed outside human law, human understanding, and human control. They had demonstrated their willingness to kill to protect their interests, their ability to coordinate complex operations against human targets, and their capacity for technological adaptation that suggested they might eventually pose an existential threat to human civilization. The question that haunted me throughout my retirement was whether the government's policy of secrecy and containment was protecting humanity from a dangerous enemy or preventing us from establishing peaceful relations with a species that might become either our greatest allies or our most formidable adversaries. The answer came in 2019, 38 years after the original incident. I was contacted by a former colleague who informed me that the creature family responsible for the Webb Mitchell murders had finally been located. They had established a settlement deep in the Canadian Rockies, far from human civilization, where they had apparently been living peacefully for decades. But they weren't alone. Satellite imagery revealed a community of at least 50 individuals representing multiple family groups that had converged from across North America. They had built structures, established agriculture, and created what appeared to be a permanent settlement designed to be completely self-sufficient and invisible to human detection. Most significantly, they had developed technology. The settlement included sophisticated communication equipment, power generation systems, and what appeared to be manufacturing facilities capable of producing advanced materials and components. The creatures had apparently spent decades studying human technology and had begun developing their own versions adapted to their specific needs and capabilities. They're not just hiding anymore, my former colleague told me during our clandestine meeting. They're building something. The intelligence community believes they're preparing for eventual contact with human civilization, but on their own terms rather than ours. The implications were staggering. An intelligent species with advanced technology, intimate knowledge of human weaknesses, and a demonstrated willingness to use violence when threatened was preparing for some kind of formal interaction with humanity. Whether that interaction would be peaceful or hostile remained unknown, but the creatures would be approaching from a position of strength rather than vulnerability. The blood-written message from 1981 had contained a warning that we had failed to heed. Leave us in peace or face the consequences of your intrusion. For nearly 4 decades, the government had pursued a policy of surveillance, harassment, and attempted elimination that had driven the creatures to develop defensive capabilities far beyond anything we had imagined. Now, as I face my final years, I realize that the secret I've carried for so long may be about to become irrelevant. The creatures are preparing to reveal themselves on their own terms, and when they do, humanity will face a reckoning that we are completely unprepared for. The message written in human blood on that cabin wall wasn't just a warning about the consequences of threatening their children, it was a declaration of independence from a species that had proven itself unworthy of trust or cooperation. We had been given a choice between peaceful coexistence and conflict, and through our actions over the following decades, we had chosen conflict. The creatures had spent 40 years preparing for that conflict, developing capabilities and alliances that would allow them to engage with humanity from a position of strength. When the time comes for formal contact, we will not be dealing with primitive forest dwellers seeking protection from human encroachment. We will be facing a technologically advanced species with intimate knowledge of our weaknesses and a justified grievance against our treatment of their people. The Webb Mitchell murders were not just a crime to be investigated and solved. They were the opening shots in a conflict that has been building for decades. The intelligence revealed in that blood-written message was not just evidence of consciousness, but a preview of the strategic thinking and moral reasoning that would guide the creature's long-term response to human aggression. We had been warned, and we had chosen to ignore that warning. Now we will face the consequences of our choice. The story I've told you is true, every word of it documented in classified files that officially don't exist. The creatures responsible for the Webb Mitchell murders are still alive, still watching, still preparing for a future that will challenge everything humanity believes about intelligence, consciousness, and our place in the natural order. When that future arrives, and it will arrive soon, we will discover that the monsters we feared in the darkness were actually people defending their families from the real monsters, us. The blood-written message on that cabin wall contained a truth that we were too arrogant and too afraid to accept. We are not alone in our intelligence, and we are not automatically entitled to dominance over other conscious beings. The creatures gave us a choice between coexistence and conflict, and through our actions, we chose conflict. Now we will learn what it means to face an enemy that knows us better than we know ourselves, that has spent decades studying our weaknesses, and that has every moral justification for viewing us as a threat to be eliminated rather than a species to be negotiated with. The warning was written in blood 43 years ago. The consequences of ignoring that warning are about to be written in history. If you made it this far, leave a comment and subscribe. It helps stories like this continue to be told.